The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. Rosa rubbed her tired eyes and rolled out of bed, her feet hitting the cold wooden floor of her tiny studio apartment. The same routine waited for her. Shower, instant coffee, and 20 minutes to get ready before catching the bus to Mel's Diner. As she brushed her teeth, Rosa caught her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. Dark circles under her brown eyes told the story of another restless night. Her hands, once soft and graceful, now showed the marks of her reality, small cuts from broken plates, burns from hot coffee pots, and calluses from carrying heavy trays. All day long, the old upright piano in the corner of her apartment seemed to watch her get ready. Dust had settled on its keys like a thin blanket, and sheet music lay scattered and forgotten on top. Rosa tried not to look at it most mornings. It hurt too much to remember what those keys once meant to her. 20-8 years old, and this was her life: wake up, work, sleep, repeat. The dreams she once had felt like they belonged to someone else now. The bus ride to work took 30 minutes through the busy city streets. Rosa pressed her face against the cold window and watched other people starting their days. A businessman in an expensive suit talked loudly on his phone about some important deal. A mother struggled with 2 young children and a stroller. Students with backpacks laughed together as they headed to the university. Rosa wondered what it would feel like to have somewhere exciting to go each morning. Instead, she was heading to serve coffee and eggs to people who barely looked at her face. Mel's Diner sat on the corner of 5th Street in Maine, its neon sign flickering like it might give up any day. The building was old, with cracked paint and windows that needed cleaning, but it was busy especially during breakfast and lunch hours. Rosa had been working there since she was 25, when her money ran out and her dreams got too expensive to keep. "Morning, Rosa," called out Janet, the other waitress who worked the morning shift. Janet was in her 50s and had been at Mel's for over 15 years. She was kind but tired, like everyone who worked there too long. "Morning," Rosa replied, tying her apron around her waist. The uniform was simple: black pants, white shirt, and a brown apron with Mel's Diner printed in faded letters across the front. She had 3 sets of the same outfit, and they all smelled like bacon grease no matter how many times she washed them. The first customers started coming in at 6 a.m., construction workers, wanting coffee and donuts before starting their day. Office workers grabbing breakfast sandwiches to eat on their way to work. Retired people who came in for the cheap coffee and conversation. Rosa moved between tables with practiced ease. Coffee for table 3, pancakes for table 7, more napkins for the family with young kids at table 12. Her feet hurt in the old sneakers she wore, but comfortable shoes cost money she didn't have. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked the man at table 5, forcing a smile. He barely looked up from his newspaper. "Just the check," he said, not bothering to make eye contact. This happened dozens of times every day. People ordering food, eating, paying, leaving. Rosa was part of the background, invisible except when they needed something. Sometimes she wondered if she was disappearing a little bit more each day. During her break, Rosa sat in the back alley behind the diner. The fresh air felt good after being inside with the cooking smells and cigarette smoke. She pulled out her wallet and counted the bills inside. Rent was due in 5 days, and she was short again. Maybe she could pick up an extra shift this weekend. Hidden behind the bills was a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. Rosa knew she shouldn't look at it, but her fingers found it anyway. She unfolded it carefully and read the words she had memorized long ago. "Dear Miss Rosa Martinez, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the Juilliard School's Bachelor of Music program. The letter was dated 10 years ago. Rosa had been 18 then, fresh out of high school and full of hope. She had practiced piano for 12 hours a day, dreaming of becoming a concert pianist. Her high school music teacher had encouraged her to audition for the best music schools in the country. Getting into Juilliard had felt like winning the lottery. Her parents had cried with joy when the letter came. The whole neighborhood had heard about Rosa Martinez, the girl who was going to New York to become a famous musician. but dreams cost money. Even with a partial scholarship, the remaining tuition, room and board, books, and living expenses were more than her family could afford. Her father worked at a factory and her mother cleaned houses. They had tried to help, but it wasn't enough. Rosa had spent 2 years at the local community college instead, studying music and working part-time jobs to pay for school. She kept telling herself she would transfer to a 4-year university, maybe even still make it to New York someday. But life had other plans. Her father got sick and couldn't work. Medical bills piled up. Rosa had to quit school and work full-time to help support her family. First at a grocery store, then at a restaurant, and finally at Mel's Diner. The years had slipped by like water through her fingers. Her father got better, but by then Rosa was trapped in a cycle of working just to pay bills. There was never enough. Money left over for school, never enough time to practice piano seriously. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in her wallet. Keeping it was probably foolish, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It was proof that once someone had believed she was talented enough for greatness. Back inside the diner, the lunch rush was starting. Rosa tied her apron tighter and got back to work. As she walked between tables, carrying plates and refilling coffee cups, her mind wandered like it always did. Her fingers moved unconsciously, pressing against the sides of coffee cups as if they were piano keys. Even while working, her muscle memory couldn't forget the feeling of playing music. She would catch herself tapping out rhythms on the edge of tables, or humming melodies under her breath while she worked. The old upright piano in her apartment had belonged to her grandmother. It was out of tune now, and some of the keys stuck when you pressed them. Rosa told herself she kept it for sentimental reasons, but the truth was more complicated. Having it there was like keeping a small piece of her dreams alive, even if she never played it anymore. Sometimes late at night, when the neighbors were asleep, Rosa would sit at the piano bench and put her hands on the keys. But she never pressed down. The silence felt safer than the sound of her dreams falling apart. As the day wore on and her feet got more tired, Rosa wondered if this was all there would ever be. Wake up, work, sleep, repeat. The same conversations with the same customers, the same ache in her back from carrying heavy trays, the same small paycheck that never seemed to be enough. She was 28 years old, and already she felt like life was passing her by. The girl who had dreamed of playing piano in concert halls around the world now counted tips at the end of each shift, hoping to have enough for groceries and rent. But somewhere deep inside, buried under 3 years of routine and disappointment, that girl still existed. She was waiting, like the dusty piano in Rosa's apartment, for someone to remember she was there. It was a Tuesday evening when everything started to change for Rosa, though she didn't know it at the time. The dinner rush at Mel's Diner was particularly busy that night. Rain had been falling steadily since afternoon, driving people inside. To seek warmth and comfort food, Rosa was balancing 3 plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes when she noticed the elderly man sitting alone at table 6. He was different from the usual customers. While most people rushed through their meals, checking phones or talking loudly, this man sat quietly, observing everything around him with gentle, curious eyes. He was probably in his 70s, with silver hair neatly combed back and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, a brown sweater over a white shirt, dark pants and polished shoes that had seen many years but were still cared for. There was something about the way he carried himself that suggested a lifetime of dignity and learning. Rosa approached his table with her usual professional smile, the one she had perfected over 3 years of serving customers who rarely saw her as more than part of the furniture. "Good evening," she said, pulling out her notepad. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" The man looked up at her with kind blue eyes that seemed to actually see her, not just look through her like most customers did. "Coffee would be wonderful, dear. And thank you for asking so nicely. You have a lovely voice." Rosa was surprised by the compliment. Most customers barely acknowledged her existence beyond placing their orders. "Thank you," she said, feeling a small warmth in her chest. "I'll be right back with that coffee." As she walked away, Rosa found herself standing a little straighter. It had been a long time since anyone had noticed something positive about her. Even something as simple as her voice. She returned with the coffee pot and a clean cup. The man thanked her again, and Rosa noticed his hands as he reached for the sugar. They were the hands of someone who had worked with precision and care, long fingers, clean nails with a slight tremor that comes with age but still held grace in their movement. "What can I get you for dinner tonight?" Rosa asked. "What would you recommend?" the man asked, genuinely interested in her opinion. This almost never happened. Most customers knew exactly what they wanted or just pointed to something on the menu without much thought. Rosa considered the question seriously. "Well, the pot roast is really good tonight. Cook made it fresh this morning, and the vegetables are tender. Or if you want something lighter, the chicken soup is homemade and perfect for a rainy night like this." The man smiled, and Rosa noticed how it lit up his entire face. "The pot roast sounds perfect. You clearly know your food." As Rosa wrote down his order, something strange happened. Without thinking, her free hand began tapping a rhythm on her notepad. It was unconscious, a habit she had developed over the years. Her fingers moved in the pattern of a piece she used to love playing. Bach's invention, No. 1 in C major. The man's eyes immediately focused on her hand movements. He watched for a moment, then looked up at her face with sudden interest. That's Bach," he said quietly. Rosa's hand stopped moving immediately, as if she had been caught doing something wrong. Her cheeks turned red with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was ... Don't apologize," the man said gently. "That was beautiful." "You have excellent finger technique, even without a piano. How long have you been playing?" Rosa felt her heart skip a beat. No one had asked her about music in years. She looked around the busy diner, suddenly aware that she was still working, still on the clock. I used to play," she said carefully, "a long time ago." The man studied her face with the same careful attention he had given to her finger movements. "Used to? Music like that doesn't just disappear from someone's hands." "I should know. I've been teaching piano for over 40 years. Rosa felt something stir inside her chest, like a sleeping bird being gently awakened. "You're a piano teacher?" "Was," the man corrected with a gentle smile. "I'm retired now." "My name is Professor William Chun, though most people just call me Professor Chun. I taught at the conservatory downtown until last year." Rosa had heard of the conservatory. It was where serious musicians studied, where people went when they were talented enough and lucky enough to make music their life's work. It might as well have been on another planet from where she stood now. "I'm Rosa," she said quietly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Rosa, and please don't look so worried. There's nothing wrong with carrying music in your hands even when you're not playing. In fact, it tells me that music is still very much alive in you." Other customers were starting to look around for service, and Rosa knew she needed to keep working. But something about this conversation felt important in a way she couldn't explain. "I should get your order to the kitchen," she said reluctantly. "Of course," Professor Chun said with understanding. "But Rosa, before you go, do you still play at all?" The question hit her like a gentle punch to the stomach. Rosa thought about the dusty piano in her apartment, about the dreams she had carefully buried under 3 years of practical concerns. "Not really," she admitted. "Life got in the way, I guess." Professor Chun nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. Life has a way of doing that. But sometimes life also provides unexpected opportunities to reconnect with the things that matter most to us. Rosa wasn't sure what he meant by that, but she filed the comment away in her mind as she hurried to the kitchen to place his order. For the rest of the evening, Rosa found herself stealing glances at table 6. Professor Chun ate his dinner slowly, seeming to savor each bite. He read a book while he ate, occasionally looking up to watch the other customers or smile at Rosa when she passed by. When she brought him his check, he surprised her again. "Rosa, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what pieces did you used to play? Your finger movements suggested classical training." Rosa hesitated. Talking about her musical past felt like opening a door she had worked hard to keep closed. But there was something about Professor Chun's genuine interest that made her want to answer. I studied classical piano through high school, she said. Slowly, Batch Mozart Chopin. I even got accepted to Juilliard, but she stopped, not wanting to go into the painful details. Professor Chun's eyebrows rose with respect. Juilliard? That's quite an achievement. You must have been very talented. Must have been, Rosa repeated, tasting the sadness in those words. Professor. Chun was quiet for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flyer. I probably shouldn't be bothering you with this, but there's something happening next month that you might find interesting. He handed Rosa the flyer. It was printed on bright yellow paper and announced a community concert at the local community center. Amateur musicians welcome. Share your gift with your neighbors, read the headline. It's nothing fancy, Professor, Chun explained. Just local people who love music getting together to perform for each other. Some are students, some are retirees like me, some are people who just play for fun. Everyone is welcome, regardless of skill level. Rosa stared at the flyer, her hands trembling slightly. I couldn't, she said immediately. I haven't performed in years. I'm not good enough anymore. Music isn't about being good enough, Professor Chun said gently. It's about sharing something beautiful with the world. And from what I observed tonight, you still have plenty of beauty to share. Rosa folded the flyer and put it in her apron pocket, not sure why she was keeping it. Thank you, but I really couldn't. I work 2 jobs and I don't even have time to practice and... Of course, Professor Chun said kindly. I understand completely. But sometimes the things we think we don't have time for are exactly the things we need most. He left a generous tip and stood to go, putting on an old but well-maintained coat. At the door, he turned back to Rosa one more time. Rosa, if you ever change your mind, or if you just want to talk about music, I'm at the diner most Tuesday evenings. Music has a way of calling us back when we're ready to listen. After he left, Rosa found herself touching the flyer in her pocket throughout the rest of her shift. She tried to focus on her work, but Professor Chung's words kept echoing in her mind. That night, as she rode the bus home, Rosa pulled out the flyer and read it again. The concert was still 3 weeks away. She thought about the dusty piano waiting in her apartment, about the dreams she had put away like old clothes that no longer fit. For the first time in years, Rosa wondered what might happen if she tried to remember who she used to be. 3 days passed before Rosa finally touched the piano again. The yellow flyer had been burning a hole in her pocket, following her to work and back home each day. She would take it out sometimes during her breaks, reading the words over and over until they were memorized. It was Friday night when she finally made the decision. Rosa had finished her shift at the diner, and her feet were particularly sore from being on them for 10 straight hours. The apartment felt smaller than usual when she walked in, the walls seeming to press closer together in the dim light. The old upright piano sat in the corner like a sleeping giant. Rosa approached it slowly, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. Her grandmother's piano had been with her through 3 different apartments, each one smaller than the last. It was probably worth more than everything else she owned combined, but she could never bring herself to sell it. Rosa lifted the keyboard cover, and dust particles danced in the evening light filtering through her small window. The black and white keys stared back at her, patient and waiting. Some of the white keys had yellowed with age, and she noticed a few had small chips along the edges. She sat down on the old bench, adjusting its height like she had done thousands of times before. The bench creaked under her weight. It needed tightening. But that was just another thing on her endless list of repairs she couldn't afford. Rosa placed her hands on the keys, but didn't press down yet. Her hands looked different now than they had 10 years ago. The calluses from carrying trays had changed the texture of her fingertips. Her nails were shorter, cut for practical work rather than music. But the shape of her hands was the same. The span of her fingers still remembered their training. She pressed middle C with her right index finger. The note rang out, slightly flat and hollow-sounding, but still recognizably a piano note. The sound seemed loud in the quiet apartment, and Rosa immediately worried about her neighbors. Mrs. Patterson lived in the apartment below, and she often complained about noise after 8 p.m. Mr. Rodriguez next door worked night shifts and slept during the day. Rosa had trained herself to walk quietly, talk softly, and generally exist without bothering anyone around her, but something about that single note made her press another key, then another. Soon she was playing a simple C major scale, her fingers, remembering the pattern even after years away. The piano was definitely out of tune, but the muscle memory was still there. Buried but not forgotten. The scale felt clumsy at first. Her fingers stumbled over keys they once knew perfectly, but as she repeated it, slowly and carefully, some of the old smoothness began to return. Left hand, right hand, both hands together. The basic exercises that had once been as natural as breathing. Rosa stopped when she heard a thump from the apartment below. Mrs. Patterson was probably hitting the ceiling with her broom handle, her usual signal for too much noise. Rosa looked at the clock. It was only 7:30, but she didn't want to start a fight with her neighbor. She closed the keyboard cover and went to make dinner. But her fingers kept moving on their own, practicing scales on the kitchen counter. While she waited for her pasta to cook. The next morning was Saturday, and Rosa didn't have to work until the evening shift. She woke up thinking about the piano, about how strange it had felt to play again after so long. Her fingers actually felt sore, which seemed impossible after playing for such a short time. By noon, she couldn't resist anymore. She opened the keyboard cover again and started with scales, trying to warm up her hands the way her old teacher had taught her. 5-finger patterns, arpeggios, chromatic runs. Her fingers felt stiff and uncoordinated, like trying to write with her non-dominant hand, but slowly, gradually things began to come back. Rosa found herself attempting a simple batch invention she had learned in high school. The left-hand part came easier than the right hand, which surprised her. Her fingers stumbled and stopped, started again, stumbled again. This time she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door, then a gentle knock. Rosa's heart sank, expecting Mrs. Patterson with a complaint. But when she opened the door, she found little Amy from across the hall. Amy was 7 years old and lived with her grandmother. She was a quiet child who sometimes smiled shyly at Rosa in the hallway, but rarely spoke. "Are you playing piano?" Amy asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Rosa felt embarrassed, like she had been caught doing something foolish. "I was just sorry if it was too loud." "It wasn't too loud," Amy said quickly. "It was pretty. My grandma said maybe you were a piano teacher." "Oh, no," Rosa said, shaking her head. "I'm not a teacher. I used to play a little bit." Amy looked disappointed. "I always wanted to learn piano, but lessons cost too much money." Something about the way Amy said this touched Rosa's heart. She heard her own childhood in those words, the longing for something beautiful that seemed just out of reach. "Would you like to see the piano?" Rosa asked impulsively. Amy's face lit up like Christmas morning. She nodded eagerly, and Rosa stepped aside to let her into the small apartment. The little girl approached the piano with the reverence most people reserve for museums or churches. She reached out one small finger and pressed a key gently, listening to the sound with complete attention. "It's beautiful," Amy whispered. Rosa sat down at the bench and patted the space beside her. "Would you like to try playing something?" For the next hour, Rosa showed Amy how to find middle C, how to play a simple melody with one finger, how to use both hands together. Amy was a quick learner and laughed with delight every time she successfully played a new note. "You're a good teacher," Amy said as Rosa walked her back to her own apartment. "I'm not a teacher," Rosa repeated, but the words felt less certain this time. That evening at work, Rosa found herself distracted. Her hands moved automatically through the motions of serving customers, but her mind kept drifting back to the afternoon with Amy, to the feeling of sharing music with someone who was genuinely excited about it. When Tuesday came around again, Rosa looked forward to seeing Professor Chun at the diner. Sure enough, he appeared at table 6 during the dinner rush, ordering the same pot roast and greeting Rosa with his kind smile. "How has your week been, Rosa?" he asked when she brought his coffee. Rosa hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I started playing piano again," she said quietly. Professor Chun's face brightened with genuine pleasure. That's wonderful news. How did it feel? Rusty, Rosa admitted with a small laugh. Very rusty. My fingers felt like they forgot everything. They used to know. That's perfectly normal, Professor Chun assured her. It's like riding a bicycle after years away. The memory is there, but it takes time to feel smooth again. What pieces are you working on? Just scales mostly. And I tried a batch invention, but it was pretty terrible. Batch is excellent for getting your technique back, Professor Chun nodded approvingly. The patterns help retrain your muscle memory. Are you thinking about the concert at all? Rosa had been dreading this question, but also hoping he would ask. I don't know, she said honestly. Part of me wants to try, but I'm scared I'll embarrass myself, and I don't even know if I can get time off work. What would you want to play if you decided to do it? Rosa had actually been thinking about this. There's a Chopin nocturne I used to love, the one in E-flat major, but I haven't played it in years and it's probably too difficult now. Professor Chen's eyes lit up with recognition. The nocturne in E-flat. That's a beautiful choice. It's technically challenging, but very expressive. The kind of piece that lets you put your heart into the music. I used to play it when I was feeling sad or homesick, Rosa admitted. It felt like the music understood how I was feeling. That's exactly what Chopin intended, Professor Chun said softly. Music should be a conversation between the composer, the performer, and the listener. It sounds like you already understand that. The rest of the week, Rosa found herself practicing more and more. She would get up 30 minutes earlier in the morning to play scales before work. During her lunch breaks, she would sit in the back alley behind the diner and practice finger exercises on the picnic table. Her neighbors seemed to be getting used to the piano sounds. Mrs. Patterson hadn't complained again, and Amy had started appearing at Rosa's door most afternoons, eager for another piano lesson. The old piano was still out of tune, and Rosa couldn't afford to have it fixed properly, but she was learning to work around the flat notes and sticky keys. In some ways, the imperfections made her listen more carefully, play more thoughtfully. 2 weeks before the concert, Rosa made a decision that surprised even herself. She walked into the community center during her day off and found the woman organizing the event. I'd like to sign up to perform, Rosa said, her voice shaking slightly, the organizer. A cheerful woman named Linda handed Rosa a form to fill out. What will you be playing? Rosa took a deep breath. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Beautiful choice, Linda said with a smile. We're so glad you're joining us. Walking home with the registration form in her pocket, Rosa felt a mixture of terror and excitement she hadn't experienced in years. She had 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to remember how to be the musician she used to be. That night, she played the Nocturne from memory for the first time in over 5 years. With only 2 weeks left before the concert, Rosa's world suddenly felt much smaller and much larger at the same time. Smaller because every spare moment was now dedicated to practicing the Nocturne, and larger because the weight of what she had committed to do seemed to grow heavier each day. The registration form sat on her kitchen table like a small white reminder of the promise she had made to herself. Every morning when she ate her breakfast of toast and instant coffee, she would stare at it and wonder what had possessed her to sign up. What was she thinking? She was a waitress who hadn't performed in public for over 10 years. The people at the concert would be real musicians, people who never stopped playing, people who belonged on stage. Rosa's practice sessions became more intense but also more frustrating. The Nocturne was coming back to her slowly, like trying to remember a conversation from childhood. Some passages flowed beautifully, her fingers finding the melody with surprising grace, but other sections felt impossible, as if the notes were written in a foreign language she had once known but forgotten. The most difficult part was the middle section, where Chopin had written these intricate runs that required both hands to dance together in perfect timing. Rosa's left hand would start strong, playing the deep bass notes that gave the piece its foundation. But when her right hand came in with the delicate melody on top, everything would fall apart. Her fingers would tangle together, hitting wrong notes, breaking the spell of the music. Come on, Rosa, she would whisper to herself, starting over. for the 20th time that morning. You used to be able to play this with your eyes closed, but that was the problem. The Rosa who used to play this piece with confidence was 18 years old, practicing 4 hours a day with nothing to worry about except getting into music school. This Rosa was 28, tired from working double shifts, with hands that spent more time carrying plates than touching piano keys. The second week was worse than the first. Rosa found herself waking up in the middle of the night, her heart racing from dreams about performing. In one recurring nightmare, she would sit down at the piano in front of a large audience, place her hands on the keys, and discover that she had completely forgotten how to play. The keys would make no sound, or worse, they would make horrible screeching noises while everyone in the audience laughed at her. During her shifts at the diner, Rosa's mind would wander to the difficult passages in the nocturne. She would find herself practicing fingerings on the edge of tables while taking orders, or humming the melody under her breath while refilling coffee cups. Janet, the other waitress, noticed Rosa's distraction. "You okay, honey?" Janet asked during a slow afternoon. "You seem like you've got something big on your mind." Rosa hadn't told anyone at work about the concert. It felt too personal, too fragile to share with people who knew her only as the quiet waitress who never missed a shift. "Just some personal stuff," Rosa said vaguely. But Janet had been working with people long enough to recognize when someone was carrying a heavy burden. "Whatever it is, don't let it eat you alive. I've seen too many people worry themselves sick over things that turn out fine in the end." Rosa appreciated Janet's kindness, but she wasn't sure this would turn out fine. Every day, the voice in her head grew louder, telling her she was making a huge mistake. Who was she kidding? She wasn't a pianist anymore. She was a waitress with a dusty piano and delusions of talent. The worst moment came on the Wednesday before the concert. Rosa was practicing the nocturne for what felt like the 100th time that week when everything went wrong at once. Her left hand cramped up during a difficult passage, causing her to hit a cluster of wrong notes that sounded like a cat walking across the keyboard. The frustration that had been building for days suddenly exploded. "This is ridiculous!" She shouted at the piano, her voice echoing in the small apartment. "I can't do this. I'm not good enough." She stood up from the bench so quickly that it wobbled and nearly fell over. Rosa paced around her tiny apartment, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. What had Professor Chun been thinking, encouraging her to try this? What had she been thinking, believing she could just pick up where she left off 10 years ago? Rosa grabbed her phone and almost called the community center to withdraw from the concert. Her finger hovered over the number, and she could already imagine the relief she would feel when she admitted defeat. No more sleepless nights, no more cramped fingers, no more anxiety about embarrassing herself in front of strangers. But before she could dial, there was a soft knock at her door. Rosa wiped her eyes and opened it to find little Amy standing in the hallway with her grandmother. "Rosa, dear," Amy's grandmother said gently, "we heard you practicing, and Amy insisted we come check on you." She was worried because the music stopped suddenly. Amy looked up at Rosa with serious 7-year-old eyes. "Are you okay? You sounded sad." Rosa knelt down to Amy's level, trying to compose herself. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just having a hard time with a difficult song." "The pretty one you always play?" Amy asked. "The one that sounds like it's telling a story." Rosa nodded, surprised that Amy had been listening so carefully to her practice sessions. "My grandma says when something is hard, it means it's important," Amy said with the wisdom that sometimes comes from children. "She says the best things are usually hard to do." Amy's grandmother smiled apologetically. "I hope we're not intruding. Amy has been so excited about your piano playing. She talks about it constantly." "You're not intruding at all," Rosa said, and she meant it. Something about Amy's presence was calming her racing heart. "Would you like to come in for a minute?" Rosa offered. Amy's face lit up, and her grandmother nodded graciously. They settled on Rosa's small couch while Rosa made tea for the adults and found a juice box for Amy. "Amy tells me you've been giving her piano lessons," the grandmother said. "That's very kind of you." "She's a quick learner," Rosa replied. watching Amy, who had wandered over to the piano and was gently pressing keys with one finger. "Rosa," Amy called from the piano bench, "will you play the pretty song for us?" "Please?" Rosa felt her stomach tighten with the familiar anxiety, but looking at Amy's hopeful face, she couldn't refuse. She sat down at the bench next to the little girl and placed her hands on the keys. "This is the song I'm going to play at a concert next week," Rosa said, surprised to hear herself admit it out loud. "A real concert?" Amy's eyes grew wide with amazement. "Like on TV?" Rosa laughed despite her nerves. "Not quite like TV, but yes, a real concert with real people watching." She began playing the nocturne slowly and carefully. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but having an audience of two people who genuinely wanted to hear the music helped calm her nerves. The melody flowed out of the old piano, imperfect but heartfelt. When she finished, Amy applauded enthusiastically, while her grandmother smiled with genuine appreciation. "That was beautiful, dear," the grandmother said. "You have a real gift." "It wasn't perfect," Rosa said automatically. "I made several mistakes, and there's this one section that I just can't get right." "Honey," the grandmother said gently, "I've lived for 73 years, and I can tell you that nothing beautiful is ever perfect. It's the imperfections that make it human, that make it touch our hearts." After Amy and her grandmother left, Rosa sat at the piano for a long time without playing. She thought about what the older woman had said about imperfections making things human. She thought about Amy's excitement about the real concert. She thought about Professor Chun's gentle encouragement and his belief that she still had music to share with the world. Maybe the point wasn't to be perfect. Maybe the point was just to share something beautiful, even if it came with mistakes and nervousness and years of rust. Rosa opened the piano bench and pulled out the yellow flyer that had started this whole journey. At the bottom, in small print, she noticed words she hadn't paid attention to before. "Come as you are. Music is for everyone." She placed the flyer on the piano and began practicing again, but this time with a different goal. Instead of trying to play perfectly, she focused on playing honestly, on letting the music express what she was feeling, the fear, the hope, the sadness, and the small flame of courage that refused to be extinguished. The nocturne still wasn't perfect when she finally went to bed that night. But it was hers, and for the first time in weeks that felt like enough. The day of the concert arrived like a storm that Rosa had been watching approach for weeks. She woke up at 5 in the morning, 2 hours before her alarm, with her heart already racing. The apartment felt different somehow, as if the walls knew that today was going to change everything. Rosa had taken the day off from the diner, using a precious sick day that she couldn't really afford to lose. But Janet had covered for her without asking questions, sensing that whatever Rosa was doing was important. "Go do what you need to do, honey," Janet had said with a knowing smile. The morning hours crawled by like thick honey. Rosa tried to practice the nocturne one last time, but her hands were too shaky to play properly. Every note sounded wrong, and she kept forgetting passages that she had played perfectly just yesterday. She finally gave up and closed the piano, afraid that more practice would only make things worse. Instead, she cleaned her apartment, did laundry, organized her closet, and tried every distraction she could think of. Nothing worked. The concert was happening at 7 o'clock that evening, and every minute that passed felt like an hour. Around noon, Rosa pulled out the only dress she owned that was suitable for performing. It was a simple black dress that she had bought 3 years ago for a cousin's wedding. She had worn it exactly twice since then, once to the wedding and once to a job interview that hadn't worked out. The dress still fit, but barely. Working at the diner had changed her body, making her stronger, but also more tired looking. She tried the dress on and stood in front of her small bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, not the confident 18-year-old who had dreamed of concert halls, but not quite the defeated waitress either. Someone in between, someone trying to bridge two different versions of herself. At 4 o'clock, Rosa couldn't stand being alone with her thoughts anymore. She decided to walk to the community center early, just to see the space and try to calm her nerves. The building was only 6 blocks from her apartment, But the walk felt like a journey to another planet. The community center was an old brick building that had probably been a school once upon a time. Large windows lined the front, and Rosa could see people inside setting up chairs and adjusting lights. The sight of actual preparation happening made everything feel suddenly real and terrifying. Rosa walked around the block 3 times before she finally gathered the courage to go inside. The lobby smelled like coffee and old books, with bulletin boards covered in announcements for yoga classes, senior citizen activities, and children's art programs. It was the kind of place where regular people came to do regular things, not where magical musical moments happened. "Are you here for the concert?" asked a woman with gray hair and a friendly smile. She was carrying a clipboard and wearing a name tag that said, "Linda, Volunteer Coordinator." Rosa nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly. "Wonderful. Are you a performer, audience?" "Performer," Rosa managed to whisper. Linda's face brightened. "How exciting." "What's your name, dear?" "Rosa Martinez." Linda flipped through the pages on her clipboard until she found Rosa's name. "Here you are. Piano, Chopin Nocturne. That's going to be beautiful. Have you performed here before?" Rosa shook her head. "Well, you're in for a treat. Our audience is lovely, very supportive. Everyone here just loves music, regardless of experience level. Come on, let me show you the performance space." Linda led Rosa down a hallway lined with children's artwork and into a large room that had been set up like a small concert hall. About 60 folding chairs faced a small stage area where an old upright piano sat under warm stage lights. The piano was larger and probably in better tune than Rosa's apartment piano, but it still looked friendly and approachable. "You can try out the piano if you'd like," Linda offered. "Most of our performers like to get a feel for the instrument before the show." Rosa's hands were sweating as she climbed the 3 steps onto the small stage. The piano bench was the right height, and when she pressed a few keys, the sound was clear and resonant. Much better than her old piano at home, she played a few scales quietly, trying to get used to the touch of the keys. This piano was more responsive than hers, which meant she would need to be more careful with her dynamics. But it also meant the beautiful passages in the nocturne would sound richer and more expressive. "Sounds lovely," Linda said encouragingly. "The acoustics in here are quite nice. Even our beginners sound like professionals in this room." Other performers began arriving around 5:30. Rosa watched from her seat in the front row as a diverse group of people filed in, each carrying instruments or sheet music. There was a teenage boy with a violin, an elderly woman with a flute, a middle-aged man tuning a guitar, and several other pianists of various ages. Rosa had expected to feel out of place among real musicians, but what she saw instead was a group of regular people who just happened to love music. The teenager looked almost as nervous as she felt. The elderly woman was practicing her flute piece quietly in the corner, making the same kinds of small mistakes Rosa made during practice. The guitar player was actually reading his music from sheets taped to his instrument. "First time performing here?" asked the woman who sat down next to Rosa. She was probably in her 40s, with kind eyes and short brown hair. "First time performing anywhere in a long time," Rosa admitted. "I understand completely. I'm Patricia, and I'm playing violin tonight. I started taking lessons again last year after not playing since high school. My kids finally moved out, and I decided it was time to do something just for me." Rosa felt some of her tension ease. "I'm Rosa, piano. I haven't performed since I was 18. "That's brave of you," Patricia said with genuine admiration. "What made you decide to start again?" Rosa thought about Professor Chun, about little Amy's excitement, about the yellow flyer that had started everything. "Someone reminded me that music doesn't disappear from your hands even when you think it has." At 6:30, Linda gathered all the performers for a brief orientation. She explained the order of performances. Rosa would be 5th out of 8, right in the middle, and reminded everyone that this was a supportive, non-competitive environment. "Remember," Linda said with a warm smile, "everyone in that audience is here because they love music. They want you to succeed, Some of you might make mistakes, and that's perfectly fine. The goal isn't perfection, it's sharing something beautiful with your community. The audience began arriving at 6:45. Rosa peeked out from the small backstage area and watched people file in. There were families with children, elderly couples holding hands, young adults who looked like college students, and middle-aged people who had probably come straight from work. Rosa's heart nearly stopped when she saw Professor Chun walk in, followed by Amy and her grandmother. Amy was wearing a pretty blue dress and carrying a small bouquet of flowers. When she spotted Rosa backstage, she waved enthusiastically, and Rosa couldn't help but smile back. The first performer was the teenage boy with the violin. He played a batch piece that started shakily but grew stronger as he gained confidence. The audience applauded warmly, and Rosa could see the relief and joy on the boy's face as he took his bow. The elderly woman with the flute played a gentle Irish melody that made several people in the audience wipe their eyes. The guitar player performed a folk song and invited the audience to sing along on the chorus, which they did with enthusiasm. By the time the fourth performer finished, Rosa felt like she might throw up. Her hands were ice cold and she could hear her heartbeat in her ears. Linda appeared at her side with an encouraging smile. "You're up next, Rosa. You're going to do beautifully." Rosa stood up on legs that felt like jelly and walked toward the stage. The audience applauded as Linda introduced her, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. As she climbed the steps to the stage, Rosa's mind went completely blank. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't remember the first note of the Nocturne. She sat down at the piano bench and placed her hands on the keys. The stage lights were warm on her face, and she could see the audience watching her with friendly, expectant faces. Amy was sitting in the third row, practically bouncing with excitement. Rosa took a deep breath and tried to remember what Professor Chun had told her about music being a conversation. She wasn't here to prove anything or impress anyone. She was here to share something beautiful that lived in her heart. She found middle C with her right hand, then the opening notes of the nocturne. As the first gentle melody began to flow from the piano, Rosa felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something stronger, the pure joy of making music again. The day of the concert arrived like a storm cloud Rosa had been watching for weeks. She woke up at dawn, her heart already beating fast before she even remembered why today was different. For a moment, lying in bed, she thought about calling in sick to her own performance, just rolling over, going back to sleep, and pretending none of this was happening. But then she remembered Amy's excited face when she had promised to come watch. She remembered Professor Chun's gentle encouragement. She remembered the hours she had spent practicing, fighting through the frustration and fear. Today was the day she would find out if all of that meant anything. Rosa had requested the day off from Mel's diner, something she almost never did. Janet had looked at her curiously when she asked but didn't pry. "Take care of yourself, honey," Janet had said. "Whatever you're doing today, I hope it goes well." The morning felt endless. Rosa tried eating breakfast but could only manage half a piece of toast. She tried practicing the nocturne one more time, but her fingers felt clumsy and disconnected. Every note seemed wrong. She finally closed the piano lid, afraid that more practice would just make her more nervous. Instead, she cleaned her tiny apartment from top to bottom, organized her already organized closet, and even scrubbed the bathroom tiles with an old toothbrush. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind distracted. But every few minutes, she would glance at the clock and feel her stomach flip again. At 2 in the afternoon, Rosa laid her only good dress on the bed. It was black and simple, the same one she had worn to her cousin's wedding 3 years ago. She had tried it on the night before and was relieved it still fit, though it was a little tighter around the arms from all the tray carrying at work. Looking at the dress made everything feel real. In a few hours, she would put it on and walk onto a stage in front of strangers. The thought made her hands shake. By 4 o'clock, Rosa couldn't stay in her apartment anymore. She needed to see the place where she would be performing, needed to make it feel less scary and unknown. The community center was only a 15-minute walk away, but Rosa took the long road. circling several blocks before finally approaching the building, the Riverside Community Center was an old brick building with tall windows and worn stone steps. Rosa had walked past it hundreds of times over the years but never paid much attention. Today it looked both welcoming and terrifying at the same time. Rosa walked around the building twice before working up the courage to go inside. Through the windows, she could see people setting up chairs and testing microphones. Real preparation for a real event that she was really going to be part of. The lobby smelled like coffee and floor wax. Bulletin boards covered the walls with flyers for book clubs, exercise classes, and volunteer opportunities. Everything about the place said normal community gathering, not life-changing musical experience. "Are you here for tonight's concert?" asked a cheerful woman with silver hair and a name tag that read Helen. Rosa nodded, not sure she could speak without her voice shaking. "How wonderful! Are you performing or just here to listen?" "Performing," Rosa managed to whisper. Helen's face lit up like Rosa had just told her the best news of the day. "Oh, how exciting! What's your name, dear?" "Rosa Martinez." Helen checked her clipboard, running her finger down a list of names. "Here you are! Piano choppin'." "Oh, that's going to be lovely. Have you performed with us before?" Rosa shook her head. "Well, you're in for such a treat. Our audience is absolutely wonderful, so supportive and appreciative. Everyone here just loves music, no matter what level. Come on, let me show you the performance room." Helen led Rosa down a hallway decorated with children's artwork and photos from past community events. They passed a kitchen where volunteers were setting up a coffee table for intermission, and Rosa caught the comforting smell of homemade cookies. The performance room had been transformed from whatever it usually was into a cozy concert space. About 50 folding chairs faced a small raised platform where an upright piano sat under warm yellow lights. The piano looked friendly and well cared for, much nicer than Rosa's old instrument at home. "Feel free to try the piano if you'd like," Helen offered. "Most of our performers like to get familiar with it beforehand." Rosa's legs felt wobbly as she climbed the 2 steps onto the small stage. The piano bench was at the right height, and when she pressed a few keys, the sound was clear and warm. Much better tuned than her apartment piano, which meant she would need to adjust her touch a little. She played a quiet scale, getting used to how the keys responded. This piano was more sensitive than hers, which could be good or bad depending on how nervous her hands were during the performance. "Sounds beautiful," Helen said encouragingly. "The acoustics in this room are lovely. Even our most nervous beginners sound wonderful in here." Other performers started arriving around 5:30. Rosa watched from a chair in the front row as a mix of people came in carrying instrument cases and sheet music. A teenage girl with a violin case looked almost as nervous as Rosa felt. An older man with a guitar was quietly tuning in the corner. A woman about Rosa's age was practicing fingering patterns on a silent flute. Rosa had expected to feel out of place among real musicians. But what she saw instead were regular people who happened to love music. The teenager kept checking her tuning obsessively. The guitar player had his music taped to his instrument so he wouldn't forget the chords. Nobody looked like they belonged on a professional stage, and somehow that made Rosa feel less alone. "First time here?" asked a friendly voice beside her. Rosa turned to see a woman in her 40s with curly brown hair and laugh lines around her eyes. "First time performing anywhere in 10 years?" Rosa admitted. "I'm Diana, and I completely understand. I'm playing flute tonight, started lessons again last year after my kids got old enough to drive themselves around. Figured it was time to do something just for me." Rosa felt some of the knots in her stomach loosen. "I'm Rosa, piano, I used to play when I was younger, but life got in the way." "Life has a way of doing that," Diana agreed with a knowing smile. "But it's never too late to invite music back in." "What are you playing tonight?" "A Chopin nocturne, the one in E-flat major." Diana's eyes widened with appreciation. "Oh, that's beautiful. And brave. Chopin isn't easy." "You must be quite good." Rosa felt her cheeks warm. "I don't know about that. I'm just hoping I don't embarrass myself." "Trust me," Diana said with confidence. If you've been working on chopping, you're going to be wonderful. At 6:15, Helen gathered all the performers for a quick meeting. She explained the order. Rosa would be fourth out of 7, and reminded everyone about the supportive atmosphere. Remember, everyone in that audience chose to spend their evening here because they love music, Helen said with genuine warmth. They want you to succeed. If you make a mistake, smile and keep going. Half the time, the audience won't even notice, and the other half will just appreciate that you're human like the rest of us. The audience began trickling in at 6:45. Rosa peeked out from behind a partial wall that served as backstage and watched people find their seats. There were couples on date nights, families with children, college students, and elderly. People who probably attended every community event. Then Rosa's heart nearly jumped out of her chest. Professor Chun walked in, his kind eyes scanning the room. Behind him came Amy in a pretty yellow dress, practically skipping with excitement, followed by her grandmother carrying a small bouquet of flowers. Amy spotted Rosa peeking out and waved, so enthusiastically that several people turned to look. Rosa couldn't help but wave back, feeling a sudden rush of warmth despite her nerves. The first performer was the teenage girl with the violin. She played a Mozart piece that started with some shaky bow work but grew stronger as she settled into the music. The audience applauded warmly, and Rosa could see the pure relief and joy on the girl's face as she took her bow. Next came an elderly man who played harmonica and sang an old folk song that had half the audience humming along. Then Diana played her flute piece, a gentle melody that seemed to float through the room like a warm breeze. By the time the third performer finished, Rosa's mouth was completely dry and her hands felt like ice. Her mind kept going blank, forgetting sections of the nocturne that she had played perfectly at home. Helen appeared beside her with an encouraging smile. You're up next, Rosa. Just breathe and remember, everyone out there is rooting for you. Rosa stood up on shaking legs and walked toward the stage. The audience applauded as Helen introduced her, but the sound seemed muffled and distant. As she climbed the steps, Rosa's mind went completely blank. She couldn't remember the first note of the piece. She had been practicing for weeks. She sat down at the piano bench and placed her trembling hands on the keys. The stage lights felt warm on her face, and she could see friendly faces looking back at her expectantly. Amy was in the third row, sitting on the edge of her seat with excitement. Rosa closed her eyes for a moment and tried to remember why she was here. Not to prove anything or impress anyone, just to share a piece of music that had lived in her heart for years, waiting for this moment to come back to life. She found the opening notes and began to play. The applause seemed to go on forever, washing over Rosa like warm water after being cold for so long. She sat at the piano bench for a moment, unable to believe what had just happened. Her hands were still resting on the keys and she could feel the vibrations of the last notes still humming through the instrument. When she finally stood up and turned to face the audience, the sight nearly took her breath away. Everyone was standing, clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Amy was jumping up and down in the third row, her yellow dress bouncing like a small sun. Professor Chun had tears in his eyes and was nodding at her with a proud smile that said, "I knew. You could do it." Rosa took a small bow, her legs still shaking but now from excitement rather than fear. As she walked off the small stage, her mind felt clearer than it had in years. Something fundamental had shifted inside her during those few minutes at the piano. She felt like she had found a piece of herself that had been missing for a very long time. "That was absolutely beautiful," Helen whispered as Rosa came down the steps. "Just stunning. You should be very proud." The remaining performers came up to congratulate her. Diana, the flute player, gave her a warm hug. "You were incredible," she said with genuine admiration. "I had chills during that middle section." But Rosa barely heard the compliments. She was still processing what had just happened, trying to understand why playing that piece tonight had felt so different from all her practice sessions at home. It wasn't just that the piano was better tuned or that the acoustics were nicer. Something about sharing the music with other people had transformed it into something bigger than she had imagined possible. During intermission, Rosa was surrounded by audience members who wanted to tell her how much they had enjoyed her performance. An elderly woman with silver hair and a gentle smile approached her first. "Dear, that was absolutely magical," the woman said, taking Rosa's hands in her own. "I've been coming to these community concerts for 5 years, and that was one of the most moving performances I've ever heard. Do you teach piano by any chance?" Rosa shook her head automatically. "Oh no, I'm just diner. I don't really I'm not a real musician." The woman looked puzzled. "Not a real musician? Honey, after what I just heard, I can't imagine what you think a real musician is. Have you ever considered teaching? I have a granddaughter who's been begging for piano lessons, but we haven't found the right teacher yet." Before Rosa could respond, another woman approached. She was younger, probably in her 30s, with kind eyes and an air of quiet confidence. "Excuse me," the woman said politely. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Victoria Chun, and I run a small music studio here in town. That performance was truly exceptional." Rosa felt her heart skip. "Chun? Are you related to Professor Chun?" Victoria smiled. "He's my father. He's been telling me about a talented young woman he met at the diner where he eats dinner. I had a feeling that might be you." Rosa glanced over at Professor Chun, who was chatting with Amy and her grandmother near the refreshment table. He caught her eye and gave her a small wave, his expression suggesting he might have planned this encounter. "Your father has been very kind to me," Rosa said carefully. "He has a good eye for talent," Victoria replied. "And based on what I just heard, his instincts were absolutely correct. I'm wondering if you might be interested in discussing a part-time position at my studio. I've been looking for an assistant instructor, someone who could help with beginner students while I focus on the more advanced ones." Rosa felt the world tilt slightly. I'm not qualified to teach. I don't have any certifications or degrees in music education." Victoria laughed gently. "Some of the best teachers I know never stepped foot in a formal music education program. What matters is whether you can connect with students and help them find joy in music. Based on how you just moved an entire room full of people, I'd say you have that gift." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "Why don't you think about it? The position would be part-time, mostly evenings and weekends. It would allow you to keep your current job while you explore whether teaching feels right for you. The pay isn't amazing, but it's decent, and you'd be working with some wonderful students." Rosa took the card with trembling fingers. "Victoria Chun Music Studio, piano, voice, and theory instruction. I'm not saying you need to decide tonight," Victoria continued, "but if you're interested, give me a call next week. We could set up a time for you to observe some lessons, maybe try working with a student or two to see how it feels." Before Rosa could process what was happening, Professor Chun appeared at her side with Amy practically bouncing beside him. "Rosa!" Amy exclaimed, throwing her small arms around Rosa's waist. "You were so beautiful. The music made me feel like I was flying." Professor Chun chuckled at his granddaughter's enthusiasm. "Amy hasn't stopped talking about your practice sessions since she first heard you play. She's been telling everyone at school that her neighbor is a famous pianist." "I'm not famous," Rosa protested weakly. "You are to her," Professor Chun said warmly. "And after tonight, you might be surprised how many other people agree with her assessment." Amy tugged on Rosa's dress. "Will you still teach me piano? Even now that you're going to be a real performer?" Rosa knelt down to Amy's level, touched by the little girl's excitement. "Of course I'll keep teaching you. That is, if your grandma doesn't mind." Amy's grandmother, who had been listening to the conversation with an amused smile, stepped forward. "Mind? Are you kidding? After hearing you play tonight, I'd be honored to have you work with Amy. In fact, I'd like to pay you properly for lessons. What you've been doing for her out of kindness has been wonderful, but you deserve to be compensated for your time and expertise." Rosa felt overwhelmed by all the unexpected opportunities that seemed to be materializing out of nowhere. An hour ago, she had been a waitress who happened to play piano. Now people were talking about her as a teacher, a performer, someone with expertise worth paying for. "There's something else?" Professor Chun said quietly, glancing around to make sure. No one else was listening. "I've been talking to some colleagues at the community college. They have a music program that offers evening classes for working adults. With your background and what I witnessed tonight, I think you could easily test out of several prerequisite courses and start working toward a degree in music education." Rosa felt dizzy. "I can't afford college. I can barely afford my rent as it is." "They have scholarship programs specifically for adult learners," Professor Chun explained. "And if you were working part-time at Victoria's studio, that would count as relevant experience. The whole program is designed for people who are working full-time but want to pursue their musical dreams." Victoria nodded enthusiastically. "Dad's right. Several of my former students have gone through that program. It takes longer than traditional college, but it's completely doable while maintaining a regular job." Rosa looked around at the faces surrounding her, Amy's excitement, Professor Chun's gentle encouragement, Victoria's professional interest, Amy's grandmother's respect. A month ago, she had been invisible, serving coffee to people who barely acknowledged her existence. Tonight, she was surrounded by people who saw potential in her, who believed she had something valuable to offer. "This is all happening so fast," Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The best opportunities usually do," Victoria said with understanding. "But you don't have to decide anything tonight. Just promise me you'll think about it. The music world needs teachers who can touch people's hearts the way you just did." As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Rosa found herself holding Victoria's business card and feeling like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. She could either step back into the safety of her familiar life or jump into something unknown and potentially wonderful. Amy ran up to her one more time before leaving with her grandmother. "Rosa, when you become a famous piano teacher, will you remember that I was your first student?" Rosa smiled, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I'll never forget it, sweetheart. You believed in me before I believed in myself." Walking home that night, Rosa felt like she was floating above the sidewalk. The yellow flyer that had started this entire journey was still in her purse, but now it seemed like ancient history. She had stepped through a door tonight that she hadn't even known existed, and there was no going back to who she had been before. Tomorrow, she would have to return to her shifts at the diner, but now she knew it didn't have to be forever. For the first time in years, Rosa Martinez had choices, and all of them involved music. 6 months later, Rosa woke up to the sound of piano scales coming from her own apartment. But this time, it wasn't her playing. 8-year-old Amy was sitting at the old upright piano, carefully working through her finger exercises before school. Her little hands moved with growing confidence across the keys that had once seemed too big for her small fingers. "Good morning, teacher." Amy called out cheerfully when she heard Rosa stirring in the kitchen. Rosa smiled as she started the coffee maker. In all the changes that had happened since that concert night, having Amy call her teacher still felt like a small miracle. "Good morning, student. How are those scales coming along?" "Better," Amy announced proudly. "Listen to this one." She played a C major scale with both hands, only stumbling slightly on the fingering for her left thumb. "That's wonderful," Rosa sighed, genuinely impressed. "Remember what we talked about with your left thumb? Try tucking it under a little earlier." Amy tried again, and this time the scale flowed smoothly from bottom to top. She turned around on the bench with a huge grin. "I did it. You sure did. Keep practicing that one, and then work on your new song for 10 more minutes. I'll walk you to school before I head to work." Work. The word meant something completely different now than it had 6 months ago. Rosa still worked at Mel's diner, but only 3 days a week instead of 6. The other days she taught piano at Victoria's studio and took evening classes at the community college. The transition hadn't been easy. For the first month, Rosa had felt like she was living 2 different lives. During her diner shifts, she was still the same waitress who served coffee and took orders. But on the days she taught piano, she was someone else entirely, someone who mattered, Someone who had knowledge worth sharing. The first few students at Victoria's studio had been intimidating. Rosa kept waiting for them to realize she was just a waitress pretending to be a music teacher. But something magical happened when she sat down at the piano with them. The music took over and all her doubts disappeared. She found herself able to explain complicated concepts in simple ways, to help frustrated students find their way through difficult passages, to celebrate small victories like they were major triumphs. Victoria had been right about her natural teaching ability. Rosa had a gift for meeting students wherever they were and helping them grow from that point. She never made anyone feel bad about their mistakes, probably because she remembered so clearly what it felt like to struggle with pieces that once came easily. Her student roster had grown quickly. Word spread in the way that good news travels. In small communities, quietly but persistently. Parents told other parents about the patient teacher who had helped their child fall in love with music. Adult students recommended her to friends who had always wanted to learn piano, but felt too old or too inexperienced to start. Rosa now taught 12 regular students, ranging from 5-year-old beginners to a 70-year-old retired librarian, who had decided that learning piano was on her bucket list. Each lesson brought its own rewards and challenges. But Rosa never got tired of watching someone's face light up when they finally mastered a piece they had been struggling with. The evening college classes had been even more surprising. Rosa had been terrified that she would be the oldest student, that everyone else would be smarter and more prepared. Instead, she found herself in classrooms full of working adults who were all chasing dreams they had postponed for practical reasons. Her music theory class included a nurse who wanted to understand the lullabies she hummed to patients, a construction worker who played guitar on weekends, and a single mother who had always regretted not finishing her music degree. They studied together, helped each other with homework, and created a support system that made the challenging coursework feel manageable. Rosa's grades were excellent. All those years of listening to music, thinking about music, and carrying melodies in her head had given her a deeper understanding than she realized. The professors noticed her practical experience and often asked her to demonstrate concepts at the piano for other students. "You have the instincts of someone who's been thinking musically for years," a harmony professor had told her after class one day. "Have you considered pursuing a full degree in music education?" The question had surprised Rosa when she started. Taking classes, her goal had been modest, just to learn enough to be a better teacher for her current students. But as the weeks passed, she found herself imagining bigger possibilities. What if she could open her own studio someday? What if she could develop programs to bring music to kids who couldn't afford private lessons? What if she could become the kind of teacher who changed lives the way Professor Chun had changed hers? The financial juggling had been the hardest part of her new life. Teaching piano paid better than waitressing, but not by much when she was only working part-time. Some weeks, Rosa had to choose between buying groceries and buying sheet music for her students. But somehow, things always worked out. Victoria often found extra work for her at the studio. Amy's grandmother insisted on paying double for lessons and bringing homemade meals for Amy's teacher. Professor Chun mysteriously arranged for Rosa to receive a small scholarship that covered most of her tuition costs. The old piano in Rosa's apartment had finally been tuned, thanks to a collection that her students' parents had secretly organized. Now it sounded beautiful, and Rosa often found herself playing late into the evening after her teaching and studying were done. The Chopin Nocturne that had started everything remained her favorite piece, but she was learning new music all the time, pieces her students wanted to learn, compositions she studied in her classes, songs that simply called to her when she heard them. Her apartment looked different too. Sheet music covered every surface, pieces in progress, teaching materials, exercises for her own practice. A small keyboard sat next to her computer for when she needed to work out harmony problems for class. The walls were decorated with recital programs, thank you cards from students, and a framed photo from the community concert that had changed everything. Rosa kept in touch with her colleagues at the diner. Janet always asked about her piano teaching with genuine interest and pride. "I always knew you were meant for something special," Janet would say. The way you used to tap out rhythms on the tables, I should have known you were a musician hiding in a waitress uniform. But Rosa never forgot where she came from or the years she spent feeling invisible and stuck. When new students came to her feeling intimidated or convinced they were too old to learn, she shared her own story. She told them about the dusty piano, about the fear of performing again, about the night she almost called to cancel her spot in the community concert. Music doesn't have an expiration date, she would tell them. It waits for you, no matter how long you've been away. Amy, who had become Rosa's most devoted student and biggest cheerleader, was preparing for her first recital. She had chosen a simple folk song that she could play with confidence, and she practiced it with the same dedication Rosa had once applied to the Chopin nocturne. "Are you nervous about performing?" Rosa asked one afternoon as Amy worked through her recital piece. Amy considered the question seriously. "A little bit. But you taught me that being nervous just means something is important to you, and music is important to me." Rosa felt tears prick her eyes. This child had learned in 8 months what had taken Rosa years to understand, that fear and love often traveled together, and that the most meaningful experiences in life usually required courage. Professor Chun still came to the diner on Tuesday evenings, though now he often brought sheet music to show Rosa or stories about Amy's progress. He had become more than a mentor. He was the friend who had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself. "I have something to tell you," he said one Tuesday evening, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "The community center is planning another concert in the spring. They asked me specifically if I thought you might consider performing again." Rosa didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said immediately. "Absolutely yes." 6 months ago, that answer would have terrified her. Now it filled her with excitement. She had music to share, students to inspire, and a future that harmonized all the different parts of who she was becoming. The waitress uniform still hung in her closet, but it no longer defined her. Rosa Martinez was a teacher, a student, a performer, and a bridge between the world of practical survival and the world of beautiful, impossible dreams that sometimes came true when you had the courage to try.